Hello, and welcome to Book Circle Presents Kiss the Frog. This is another story about Gus and Doug, two regular guys who went through the army together and then afterward managed to become captured by an evil fairy, the end result of which was they found themselves transformed and transported far away from the normal world. Well, thanks to kind strangers, they got back to the normal world, but they were still transformed. I have before now read a story or two about the days after they were able to become human again. This story is about how they learned to become human again. Kiss the Frog. Doug was sleeping late. He usually slept late now. There was no job to get up for, after all. That would have to change someday, but there were other things to do first. Few employers hired monsters. He was drowsing, not really sleeping, thinking in little fragments on the plans for the day. Head back to the Field Museum with Gus and follow up on that scent, that clue, if that's what it was. They could both feel it. They agreed it was a trace of magic, worth following up. His right ear twitched, cocking a little to catch the slight sound of footsteps. These halted right at his door, which stood open. He had spent the last 5 years almost entirely outdoors and was, he now found, a little claustrophobic. Or maybe he felt the need for an escape route. He should probably work to overcome it. But meantime, he left the door open. He opened his eyes a crack. It was Amy, the older of his two younger sisters. She stood where she was just barely able to see him. When she met his gaze, she started to flinch back, then paled and looked away. "Sorry," he said. "I know it's quite a sight. I should sleep with the door shut." He pulled the sheet up over himself. Before, he would have been wearing pajamas, but he had none that fit just now. He was wearing only shorts, on backwards, so he could use the fly for his tail. He felt uncomfortable exposing his body, this body, to Amy. "Do you want me to put on the glamour cloth?" That would make him look as he did before, except for the height. "That just," she said and stopped. "Just makes it worse?" "I'm sorry I scare you," he said softly. "What's the matter?" It was his mother, her voice coming down the hall from the kitchen. A moment later, she was visible in the doorway. She looked from Amy to Doug. "I scare Amy," he mumbled, "and no wonder." "It will take getting used to," Mrs. Cheung now acknowledged, "but we have that cloth, and someday," she said to Amy, "he'll be able to turn back. Those magical people said so. Come have breakfast." This last was to both of them, so after Amy skittered past, Doug rose, threw on a bathrobe, size double extra large, bought 2 days after he came home, and followed to the kitchen. There, his father was already dressed for work in white shirt and black tie, and his grandfather was dressed for retirement in a bathrobe far more eye-catching than his own, with a pattern of peacocks in neon colors. Both were eating toast, sipping tea, and reading, though Mr. Cheung was working his way through a stack of serious-looking envelopes, while Ye-Ye, Grandpa, was reading the sports section. Both looked up and immediately caught the expressions. Mrs. Cheung looked stern, Amy looked tense and shut down, and Doug, being male, Chinese, and a soldier, he had been drilled in keeping distress out of his face more than most. But he wasn't doing a good job of it at present. He was doing all right with his human features, but his slit pupils flared wide and his feline ears and whiskers drooped. "What's wrong?" asked her father. "Nothing," Doug answered reflexively, then, since this was patently untrue, added, "that can be fixed right now." "What do you need to fix later?" asked Ye-Ye. "Or is it just—" He gestured up and down Doug's height as his grandson folded himself carefully into a kitchen chair. "Just the shape." Doug took a teacup off the counter, He would not have had the reach for this before, poured tea from the pot on the table, and huddled over it. I frighten Amy. Ye surprised him by chuckling. Stop jumping out at her and yelling boo, he advised. Doug was surprised to find that he was smiling a little. Amy looked aggravated, though that was still an improvement. I never said that, she snapped. You didn't deny it, Doug answered. He shrugged in his huddle. I'm scary. I'm sorry. I don't want to be. That's not the issue, she insisted. What is the issue? Her father asked. Amy stood silent for a few seconds. She was gathering her courage, Doug could see. She locked eyes with Doug, but he felt she was withdrawing. She said, I don't feel sure you're really Doug. Doug's heart tightened. On the one hand, this was not as bad as it might be, not quite. On the other hand, they had been through this the night he came home, and he clearly hadn't convinced her. While his mind spun, all he could do was stare back and look more than ever like a lost cat in the rain. His father echoed his thought. Okay, but we went over this when he came home. He and Gus, right here at this table, proved themselves over and over, answering questions, telling us stuff only they could know, childhood and army days, and like that. Look at this, said Mrs. Cheung. She went to the refrigerator and plucked 4 pictures off it. Not children's art, not for many years. But she, like her husband, was an optometrist, and mothers are weird. She adorned her refrigerator with photos of her children's eyes. I got curious when he said the change got rid of his astigmatism, so I examined him a couple of days ago. Look at these, before and after. She spread the photos on the table. Amy looked confused. Doug privately noted she moved to the table to look at the pictures, and so closer to him, without hesitation. What's his astigmatism got to do with it? Nothing, said Mrs. Cheung impatiently. But I took these pictures when I was testing him. Look at the irises. One photo, an old one, showed a round mandala-like image of a golden brown human iris. The other, Doug thought, looked like the eye of Sauron from the movie, but was at least the same human color. This one is slit, of course, but look at the crypts on the sides. Child of optometrists, Amy of course knew that the darker shapes in an iris are the crypts. It's the same pattern, and look at these. These are his right retina before and after. They're identical. The after one is paler, but that's his tapetum. The pattern of blood vessels is identical. Now, she concluded, I don't know how magic works, but why would he have the same retinas and the same irises, or nearly, if he wasn't Doug? Why deliberately fail to copy the face, the size, the skin, and then go ahead and copy the eyes? Amy looked at Doug. He used the eyes in question to look back. That's not what I meant, she said, and she said it to him. I don't think you're an imposter. I mean, are you still Doug? I mean, you told us your mind yanked around, being in a hive mind for years, going through all that stuff. You've told us about it, but I can't really imagine what it was like. How much... Are you still Doug? Doug did not know what to say. His mother did. Of course he's still Doug. You wouldn't be asking this if he'd got shot up in Afghanistan. What difference does this make? It's magic, Amy insisted. What can't happen? Their father said, You're right. We never knew the supernatural existed before. Ye grunted softly. He was a retired cop. He'd seen his share of odd things and was now reconsidering them in the light that his grandson had brought home. His son held up an envelope. This is the renewal for Humanist magazine. I'm not going to bother. Secularism seems quaint now. As you said, we don't know what can't happen. But this did happen. My son came back. Your brother. This is Doug. He'd been speaking matter-of-factly. Now his voice began to rise. He talks like Doug, thinks like Doug, loves us like Doug, needs us the way Doug needs us after he's been through hell and come out the other side hurt. Dad, Baba, Doug began, but his father waved him into silence. It was just as well he didn't know what he'd been going to say. But, well, he was a big boy now. He was huge, and shouldn't need his father to defend him against a younger sister, should he? Now is not the time, their father continued. You want him to be Doug? Treat him like Doug. But we can't know, Amy insisted. Look at the evidence, said Ye-Ye. Talks like Doug, reasons like Doug, emotes like Doug. That's evidence. He's Doug. He met Doug's eyes. Doug felt he was looking into a fire. I am so relieved to have you back, and so damned proud of you. I don't know which is eating me up faster. Doug had to look away from the fire. Why proud? He asked. Of the way you're holding it together. Ye-Ye looked back at Amy. Don't make it harder. I'm sorry, she said, and the creak in her voice told Doug before he looked that she was crying. Then she surprised him very much by seizing his right hand, scale and knuckle spurs and all, and squeezing it. This is the one that got cut off? She asked. Yes, you can't tell anymore. Gus got his tail cut off twice. Tempting trophy, I guess. Captain Fletcher said that regrowing our bits was a clue we could learn shapeshifting. She squeezed again. I won't make it harder. Can I help? He smiled, keeping his lips shut. He wouldn't make it harder for her by showing his teeth. Just don't tell anyone what we keep in your brother's bedroom. She smiled back. He let go her hand and rose. Where are you going? His mother demanded. You haven't had breakfast. I'm going to get dressed and call Gus. We're going back to the Field Museum to check out that lead. Breakfast before you go. Yes, ma'am. A few minutes later, Gus knocked at the apartment door just as Amy was leaving to make her way to the L and thence to the University of Chicago. Hi, Amy, he started to say as she opened the door on him. Oh, Gus, she exclaimed, hugging him just under the rib cage. He replied gingerly, hugging back. Good luck, and she darted off down the hall. Come on in, Gaijin, called Ye-Ye. The Japanese word for foreigner was his nickname for Gus. Early on in their acquaintance, Gus had accidentally said Japanese instead of Chinese, and Ye-Ye was never going to let him forget it. The first time he had called Gus Gaijin after their return to Chicago, Gus had teared up, and so had not seen Doug's grin, but Ye-Ye had seen both. Gus came in and sat in the chair next to Doug with the same care as an adult sitting on a child's chair. Both now looked human, but both were still over 7 feet tall and heavily built. Both wore boots, jeans, and ruddy brown jackets. These were gifts from the Grand Normans, who had brought them back from the outer edges of reality. They did not have a lot of clothes that fit. At the throat of each jacket peeked a thin roll of white silk, the glamour cloth that made each look as much like their old selves as possible. What's with Amy? Gus asked. We had a little, Doug began. Ye-Ye broke in. She got herself knotted up with the idea that Doug is secretly a werewolf or something and not really Doug anymore, so we dogpiled on her until she got over it. Oh, I guess she did get over it, or she wouldn't have hugged me on the way out. You ready for the museum? He asked Doug. Yep. Mrs. Chung put a white paper bag on the table between them. It gave off warmth and a savory smell. Barbecue rolls and egg tarts, she said, from the bakery across the street. Well, thanks, Mrs. C., but I figured we'd buy lunch at the museum. This is for on the L, she nodded at Doug. He only had tea and toast. What did you have? Cereal and coffee? Uh-huh. You're big, busy young men, over 300 pounds each. You'll get hungry. Mr. Chung rose and advised them, don't argue, never helps. Good luck. He shrugged into his coat while Mrs. Chung gave each of them a peck on the cheek. Their faces bore no scales. Then the doctors Chung left for their office. Ye waited for the sound of footsteps to fade, then asked, "How are things at your place, Gaijin? Anybody got whim-whams about you?" "Well, Mom cries a lot when she thinks I can't hear." Gus's ears were not only mobile and pointed, but acute. "And Dad smiles at me a little too much, and once I overheard him crying. I wear the glamour scarf a lot." He picked at the silk at his throat. "Maybe that helps." "And your sisters?" "Josie hugs me and holds my hand a lot. Maybe that's just her, though. I've been away 5 years after all. I'm kind of still getting to know her. Evie and Steve were over, and that went fine." Ye nodded. "And are there any big changes in your minds, either of you? I mean, of course, besides getting wired for tails and the big honkin' cases of PTSD?" Gus and Doug traded glances. "You think we have PTSD?" Doug asked. Ye snorted. "If you two didn't have at least a little, I'd think Amy might be right. When you first came back, you just about slept the clock around. That was natural. You could relax like you hadn't in years. But now you rouse at every little noise. Any nightmares?" "Fairly often," Doug admitted. Gus sighed and nodded. "And you're hypervigilant. Appetite goes up and down." He shoved the bag of rolls toward them. "And sometimes I just catch you doing these 1,000-yard stares. All pretty standard, really." Silence for a while. Then Doug asked, "What should we do, Ye?" The old man shrugged. "You're doing fine. Keep on keeping on. Accept help. Go easy on yourselves. Give it time." He picked up the sports section again. "Whatever happens, I'm still so proud of you." He looked at Gus. "You too, Gaijin." Gus blushed and rose. Doug rose too and picked up the bag. "Leave me one of those barbecue rolls." They left him 2 of each kind. They got off the L at Grant Park, threw away the empty bakery bag, and strolled to the Field Museum. In the main hall, they marveled nostalgically at Sue the skeletal tyrannosaur and the pair of taxidermied elephants. "I don't think I've been here since I was a kid," Gus remarked, "and now this is the 2nd time in a week." Doug nodded. "It's like how we were right here next to Lake Michigan, but I never learned to swim until I was in the Army. People are just like that." Gus laughed softly. "I guess we're still people." Doug smiled. "Guess so." The 1,000-yard stare looked out of his eyes briefly. "Hope Amy goes on thinking so." "She will. It'll be a lot easier on her once we can turn back. You just caught her off guard lying there looking like a roadkill armadillo." "Easier on everybody, especially us. I don't remember the fiberglass pterodactyl." "It was here Wednesday." "I mean from when I was a kid. Where's the Egyptian exhibit?" Their immediate goal was to go back to being human as soon as possible. However this was to be done, they needed to find their way into the Chicago magical community as the first step. They had wandered about the city, dropping in on mediums and psychics and the kind of stores that specialize in crystals and botanicals, and they developed a set of leading questions to drop, but never a whiff of magic did they feel. The psychics and shopkeepers responded only with confusion or offers of love spells, incense-heavy purifications, or, in 2 cases, overtures to join the local community of furries. Wednesday morning, after the last furry invitation, Gus's frustration boiled over. "No, we don't want to play at animals. We need help fixing this," and he had tried to snatch off his glamour scarf. It knotted. Gus had taken a private vow not to swear. He sputtered incoherently as he struggled with his vow and his scarf at the same time. Doug seized him by the elbow and gently guided him out of the store and away from the terrified teenage boy with feathers stuck in his hair wearing a Hawkman t-shirt. "That was the Sundering in action," Doug told his friend after he had calmed down. "You tried to reveal magic, and your luck turned. Stop pushing it." "Right, right." He stuck the scarf back into his jacket, jammed hands into pockets, and sulked down the sidewalk. Doug strode beside him. He noticed people clearing the sidewalk ahead of them. They might not look like scaly lion ogres at the moment, but they still looked like two extra-large samples of fullbacks in bad moods wearing something like uniforms. "Why would the Sundering care about one high school kid who's already dabbling in the occult?" Gus asked querulously. "Where was the Sundering when we got snatched in bulk by the Degoradel?" "The Sundering cares about public disclosure. There were security cameras in the shop. As for us, well, we got snatched out of its jurisdiction." "Okay, I get it. Shouldn't have popped off at the kid anyway." He gave a fuming growl. "There's got to be plenty of magic in a city this big." "Haven't picked up on any, though. Not yet." Then they tried the museum as a change of tactics. Just as the place was closing, they had finally felt a hint of magic in the Egyptian exhibit. The next day had been spent acquiring phones, gifts their families insisted on giving, and reestablishing contact with their friends and benefactors in Grand Normandy. Now it was Friday morning. They sauntered among the cases of scarabs and pottery fragments and through the reconstructed mastaba, savoring the faint tang of magic. They had learned how to do this from Grand Norman teachers who had told them the speed with which they picked it up was another sign that they were now phase. They kept on the alert for any variation in this signal. Finally, "Aha," said Doug. In a corner, half behind a small case of statuettes, was a door. It was not strictly hidden, but was working very hard at not attracting attention, being set and painted to look like a section of paneling. It had no visible hinges, and the latch was recessed. Above that latch was a small, equally shy sign reading "Personnel Only." The signal, the scent, the feel became stronger here and more individual. Something about it was familiar. "I think it's glamoured," said Gus. Doug nodded. "I don't think I'd have noticed it except for the magic trace. I guess you can't use glamour to hide magic, or it's a whole different thing." They contemplated the door. "Should we hide until the museum closes?" Gus proposed, "then break in?" Doug contemplated a little longer, then answered, "One, given guards and cameras and our sizes, I don't give us a big chance. And two, I am just plain tired of waiting." "Okay," Gus seconded. The Egyptian exhibit was popular, so they did have to wait a bit. Finally, no one was in eyeshot. They approached. Gus stuck a finger in the latch, hoping it was not locked. It was not. A scant second later, two very large bodies passed through a very small doorway. Gus went first. It was dark, but his slit pupils flared wide. Cat vision and air currents on whiskers immediately told him he was at the top of a dark, narrow stair. There was no room in the tiny landing for both. He grabbed Doug's elbow and pulled him in while crouching and starting to slither down the stairs on the small of his back to make room. As the scant second ended, Doug stepped onto the landing and closed the door behind them. Below him, Gus stood and headed down. He followed. They were in a cramped, dimly lit basement. To their shining eyes, the light was quite adequate, even though filtered fourth and fifth hand from remote sources. They stood still for several seconds, ears swiveling as they listened for alarms, voices, footsteps. Nothing. As for magic, unfortunately, the nearest and clearest trace was on the door they had just passed through, glamoured to look even more inconspicuous than it was. Gus noted this to Doug and added, "I wonder why they didn't make it just plain invisible." Doug considered the question for a bit, then offered, Well, if it gets discovered some other way, with this you can say, oh, I just missed it. But otherwise you say, hey, it's a freaking invisible door. Maybe the Sundering wouldn't even let you do anything as conspicuous as public invisibility. Gus grunted. Or I could argue that the Sundering wouldn't let the invisibility fail and get discovered. Look at me Wednesday, when I couldn't even break cover in front of that kid. Okay, take your pick of my first explanation, or I don't know. Let's scout around. They moved around quietly, despite being big and booted. The place was a maze of granite block walls containing a finer maze of shelving loaded with crates and boxes, sometimes clearly labeled, sometimes not. They didn't really pay attention to the boxes, feeling instead for magic. Ha, said Doug softly, just as Gus went, on registering a whiff of magic. Doug pointed ahead to a door with light leaking out from under it. And we'll find what's behind the door next time.